We've got a good group here this afternoon, and I am Warren Tenney. I'm co-chair for this post-2025 AMAs committee, and I'd like to turn it over to my co-chair, Cheryl.
Hi there. Sorry I was late wrapping up a call. Like everyone, everyone's super busy. So much for our summer. Want to welcome everyone, and I want to go ahead and go to the next slide if we could. This is our agenda for today. We are going to give a few updates. Again, give an overview of what we're doing. Once again, have a presentation focused this time on the unreplenished groundwater by the department, and then have our discussion and next steps. But again, the point of this is now is we're moving into our next phase of solutions. And I think we can go to the next slide. Oh, we have rules. Forgot about the rules. Do we need to go over the rules? Again, everyone stay on mute. State your name and you represent when you do speak, and please try to use the chat and we will recognize you that way. But if for some reason you just have to bust in, please do so. Now we can go to the next slide. Again, for our timeline, we're focusing in now on these, our solutions and strategies, and we are focusing in on the 3 reports that had the biggest overlap as we move forward. In June, we had a great discussion about groundwater and the assured water supply. Today, we are going to be talking about unreplenished groundwater withdrawals. Next month, we'll be talking about hydrologic disconnect. Then Warren and I will report back to the full Governor's Water Augmentation and Innovation Council on where we are with solutions. But today, we want to spend our time on unreplenished groundwater withdrawals. And please know that we are, Warren and I and other staff are keeping track of all the solutions. I know last meeting we kind of solutions and questions got mixed together, but we did keep track of all those. But again, I want to welcome you and really want to encourage you to have an open dialogue after the presentation. As well, if you want to email Warren and me or any of us with your solutions after this conversation, it doesn't have to be on today's topics. We'll be gathering those, and then at our September meeting, or actually after the council meeting, we will come back to you, and that's where we'll really start prioritizing all the solutions and concepts we have heard during this phase, and then also be talking about really what's politically viable, where is the most consensus among our group as we move forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Warren.
So next slide, please. So yes, to reiterate, we plan for the committee to continue to meet between October and December so we can discuss which ideas are most realistic to further develop into solutions that would lead to supported policy changes. We would then plan to present to the council in December any policy proposals that the committee has general consensus on. Going into 2022, the committee would continue dialogue on the issues and further consider ideas for solutions and strategies that may not have been developed by the committee, may not have yet been developed by the committee. For now, our focus is on 2021 and to work hard to develop new ideas and approaches to these issues that we can build support around and continue strong water management well beyond 2025. Before we look at unreplenished groundwater, we wanted to note 2 developments that have occurred since our last meeting that affects our committee. Next slide.
Thanks, Warren. First, as all of you already know, most likely, but since at our last meeting that we did focus in on the Pinal AMA, I just wanted to address and make sure everyone consistently heard this. After our last meeting, DWR provided clarification at a Pinal area stakeholder meeting that was primarily understood by most of us who had been involved in the Pinal issue for many years. but specifically ADR stated that it will not approve new assured water supply applications seeking to utilize groundwater within the Pinal model domain. Rather, non-groundwater importation and direct delivery are the solution. In other words, those desiring to develop within the Pinal model domain area will need to bring their own groundwater supplies. I am not bringing this up in terms of stirring this up. It is actually more motivation for all of us to come together, at least in my eyes, and the importance of our work. So with that, next slide.
So the committee identified AMA's management structure as an issue in which we want to look at. It provides an opportunity to review and implement changes to the broader regulatory framework. We had planned to address this after discussing the first three issues that we're currently working on. At the July Governor's Water Council meeting, the ADWR director requested that the Water Council look at what we should do to ensure there will be new management plan periods for the AMAs after 2025. He feels it is important for ADWR to continue to have the ability to adjust and evolve AMA management through having new management periods. At the council meeting, there was some discussion about what the management plan might look like in a 6 management period. But the director is wanting the council to focus first on finding agreement that there should be additional management periods beyond the 5th one, and to decide what the time frame for the 6th management period should be. For example, the 5th management plan won't be in effect until 2025. So does it make more sense to have the 6th management period start in 2030 or wait until 2035? Once that is agreed upon, then what should be included in the management plan itself can be discussed. As co-chairs, we believe it is positive for the Governor's Water Council as a whole to look at new AMA management periods, especially since our plate is quite full of the other issues that we are looking at in this committee. So we now want to turn it over to ADWR to provide further information about unreplenished groundwater withdrawal, the focus for today's meeting. We appreciate the time and effort ADWR staff has spent to gather information and data for this presentation. This presentation will show the current and potential future state of unreplenished groundwater pumping in the Phoenix AMA. We decided to pick on the Phoenix AMA because what is happening there is still applicable to the other AMAs, and we felt it would be more straightforward for our discussion and for ADWR to pull together data if we focused on just one AMA at this time. As we already identified in the issue brief, this additional data will show that all sectors utilize unreplenished groundwater, and therefore we all have a role to play in addressing this issue. So I'll turn it over to the ADWR team.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jenna Norris, and I coordinate the Governor's Water Council. And today, along with Natalie Mass, I will be presenting on the unreplenished groundwater withdrawals in the AMA and breaking that down by sector. Following my presentation, which will be given via slides, Natalie Mass will present, who is the director of the AMA section for management plans. We'll be sharing a data dashboard. Next slide. So here is a more detailed roadmap for today's presentation. I will start off by defining the relationship between groundwater demand and the offsets to that groundwater demand for each sector. And then, as Warren said, I will be using Phoenix AMA as a case study of sorts to take a closer look at the components that make up the pieces of groundwater demand and the offsets to those demands. The data that we are looking at today as part of this presentation is in large part pulled from the unreplenished groundwater demand table on page 15 of the unreplenished groundwater issue brief, as well as some data that we pulled together internally and analyzed. Finally, For each sector within the AMA, I will attempt to contextualize the numbers and highlight how these relationships affect overall trends and potentials for future shifts. And then we'll move to Natalie's portion of the presentation with that data dashboard. Next slide. Next slide. So we'll start out by just defining what unreplenished groundwater is. So unreplenished groundwater is groundwater demand without replenishment or obligation to artificially replenish or replace that volume back into the aquifer, and that is not offset by incidental recharge or replenishment. So the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, which is also, of course, referred to as the Code, included both existing groundwater uses, which are referred to as grandfathered water rights, as well as other exceptions, which allow for the use of unreplenished groundwater across all sectors. So on this slide, you will see that definition that I just verbally gave laid out in more of a schematic manner. So on the left-hand side in blue, you have your groundwater demand. And going down, following that arrow down, you have the components that comprise that groundwater demand for the agricultural section. That groundwater demand is then, the offset is subtracted from the groundwater demand, which gives you your unreplenished demand. For the agricultural section, that offset is comprised of the incidental recharge, which I really want to emphasize this point because it is important moving forward. The incidental recharge is calculated using the total demand of the sector. So that includes all of the utilized supplies, not just groundwater, but also CAP water, for example, other surface water supplies, et cetera. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so an overview of agriculture groundwater demand. The agricultural sector is not required to replenish, but it is subject to the mandatory conservation requirements administered by the management plans. And those conservation requirements are aimed to reduce the amount of groundwater used over time. Groundwater withdrawals from the sector can be expected to continue for as long as the land is used for agricultural purposes. Next slide. Okay, so looking again at this unreplenished demand equation for the agriculture sector, you will see that the groundwater demand is comprised of three components: IGFRs, GSF accounting, and tribal ag. In the next several slides, I will look more closely at IGFRs as they comprise the largest groundwater demand for this sector. And I want to point out that although GSF accounting does not represent physical pumping, it must be accounted for as part of the total groundwater demand because it does represent renewable water that is delivered to an irrigation district or farm, which is then accounted for under the IGFR and therefore deducted from that total water budget as groundwater. And then finally, tribal agriculture demand represents an estimate as this is not a reported figure. Next slide. Thanks, Catherine. Okay, so IGFRs, or irrigation grandfathered rights. The authority to withdraw groundwater for irrigation use. So these rights represent the authority to withdraw groundwater for irrigation use in perpetuity without a replenishment requirement. Those rights are limited to the groundwater allotment of each right, which you will see does have an asterisk following it. And that is because, like many portions of the presentation today, there is always an exception to the rule, which we will discuss more later on. But for the purposes of broadly defining IGFRs, that is an important note. And finally, no new IGFRs may be created, and the land that may be irrigated is limited to that which was historically irrigated between January 1st, 1975 and January 1st, 1980. Next slide. Okay, so now looking more closely at incidental recharge. Next slide. So, as I stated earlier, although the agriculture sector does not have a replenishment requirement, some replenishment, referred to as incidental recharge, is assumed to occur after water is applied to crops and has a chance to percolate down below the root zone and reach the aquifer. So, how is incidental recharge calculated for the agricultural sector? For the agricultural sector, for safe yield purposes, incidental recharge is calculated as an output of ADWR's regional groundwater model. Do note that that is different. That method differs from the other sectors we'll talk about today, which we'll see later. And I also wanted to point out that the management plan team is looking to moving a % of total agriculture demand to calculate this recharge for safe yield purposes, and conversations around this topic are still ongoing. Okay, so what this slide now puts all the pieces together is these are the numbers pulled from that table in the issue brief assigned to each component of this unreplenished demand equation. So you can see that the groundwater demand for the ag sector 5-year average for Phoenix AMA is 623,370 acre feet a year. That is offset by 467,183 acre feet per year of incidental recharge, calculated using the total demand of that sector. And then that demand minus that offset gives you your unreplenished demand for the Phoenix AMA agriculture sector, which is 125,000 acre feet a year. Next slide, thank you. So as I said earlier, I will try to put for each of these sectors those numbers into context. So approximately 3/4 of the agriculture sector's groundwater demand is offset by incidental recharge. That leaves 1/4 of the sector's total groundwater demand as unreplenished. So to kind of unpack that 3/4 ratio and what the significance of that means, it means that currently for the agriculture sector, that sector utilizes a wide portfolio of supplies in order to meet their demand. In the future, as agriculture is impacted by shortages, you may expect to see the sector utilize more groundwater supplies, which functionally, in terms of that ratio you're seeing of 3/4 on the screen, would increase the denominator and keep the numerator steady. So the impact would be a decrease in the amount of groundwater demand that is offset by recharge, and therefore an overall increase in the amount of unreplenished groundwater demand for the sector. So how do these figures play into the total unreplenished groundwater demand for all sectors within the Phoenix AMA? The agriculture sectors, that's on the right in blue, so the agriculture sector's unreplenished groundwater demand contributes to a little over 4/10 of the total unreplenished groundwater demand for Phoenix AMA. Next slide. Okay. So if we were to look more closely at the different components that comprise the IGFRs in Phoenix AMA, here's where that asterisk on that slide kind of comes into play. So as part of the Agriculture Conservation Program, the IGFRs operating under the base program are also have a flexibility account. This flexibility account is to allow for varying climatic and market conditions. What it functionally does is allow a IGFR user to borrow or bank groundwater from year to year. So, for example, if a IGFR had an allotment of 100 acre feet a year, and then in a given year they only utilize 80 acre feet of water, 20 acre feet of flex credits would be added to their flex account balance, and then that reverse relationship is also true. So if that same IGFR the following year used 120 acre feet, then 20 acre feet would be deducted from that flex account balance. So flex credits are cumulative with no upper limit on the number of credits that can be obtained, and the credits can be used at any time to supply more water to a crop than what is allotted to the IGFR. It is important to note, though, that functionally, with the exception of saleable credits, flex credits do have to be used on the same footprint as the farm that belongs to IGFR, or that the IGFR belongs to, rather. So this table here that is titled 5-year average pulls a 5-year average from 2012 to 2016, which is the same date range that the numbers from that table, from the issue brief, are pulled from. And so on the left-hand side, you have your sum of allotment quantity, which is 479,016 acre feet. And on the right, you have your sum of flex account balances, which is 4,373,813. And do note that the sum of the allotment quantity and the sum of those flex account balances are only for those IGFRs belonging to the base program. Next slide. So another important piece of context is that the agriculture sector does utilize a very diverse portfolio of water supplies to fulfill their demand. So in this table, you'll see the sum of water use for those IGFRs belonging to the base program on the left-hand side, which is approximate, like 470,500 approximately. And on the right-hand side, you have the sum of allotment quantity. Note that these figures, or these numbers here, are pulled from 2018. So if you are paying super close attention, you might notice that right-hand number is slightly different than the previous slide, but that is just because it's pulling from 1 year, which is 2018, versus that 5-year average. So when you take the ratio between those two numbers, you get very, very close to 1. And so what this means functionally is that on average, the aggregate use pursuant to an IGFR is close to the allotment value. And as stated earlier, if the ratios between these two figures did not shift, what can reliably be expected to shift due to shortages is the water portfolio used to supply these demands. So as Colorado River shortages are expected to significantly impact agricultural users, the sector will become more reliant on groundwater to continue fulfilling their demand. And so the sum of water use, which is right now comprised of several different supplies, will become more heavily weighted towards groundwater. Next slide. On this slide, I'm again trying to put some of those numbers that we just looked at into context. Do note that that first bullet is just an exercise to highlight the scale of flex account balances, and for practical purposes would not happen necessarily in real life, but it is a helpful tool to understand the scale. So the ratio of the sum of flex account balances to the sum of allotment quantity is just under 10. So what this means in practice is that for Phoenix AMA, IGFR holders could utilize flex credits alone for just under 10 years and fulfill their full allotment amounts. So the significance of all that I just shared is that in the context, of course, of unreplenished groundwater, which is what this presentation is on, is that both the total allotment quantity and flex credits represent potential future groundwater demand that is not subject to a replenishment requirement. Okay. Moving on to the municipal sector. So on the screen, again, you'll see this theme repeated. So you've got your groundwater demand for the municipal sector, which is comprised of your large designated providers, your large undesignated providers, small providers, large untreated providers, / urban irrigation, and domestic exempt well use. Subtracted is the offset. The difference, of course, from the last slide is that for the municipal sector, the offset is comprised of both a replenishment obligation for those providers serving assured water supply determinations, as well as incidental recharge. And again, as a reminder, that incidental recharge rate is calculated using the total demand of the sector. Next slide. So the municipal sector is required to demonstrate consistency with the management goal under the Assured Water Supply Program. Although existing municipal groundwater uses are exempt from this requirement, unless a provider were to become designated and begin serving those existing uses. And the municipal sector is also subject to a replenishment obligation, which it looks like that second bullet was supposed to say, so I'm not sure what happened there, but the municipal sector is subject to a replenishment obligation for those designated providers serving assured water supply determinations, as I stated before. Next slide. So now looking closer at the replenishment obligation and what that means for the muni sector. Next slide. So the assured water supply criteria requires that water supply must be consistent with the management goal of the AMA. Broadly, this requires a provider to attempt to achieve and maintain a long-term balance between groundwater withdrawn and groundwater recharged annually. Functionally, this can be achieved by replenishing or offsetting groundwater withdrawals. So I use the term broadly here intentionally because the management goal does slightly vary for the Pinal AMA. And I also wanted to note that demonstrating consistency with the management goal can occur through multiple mechanisms, and this criteria has most recently been met by obtaining renewable supplies or through membership in the CAGRD. That last bullet is discussing groundwater allowances, which is kind of the tie-in here for unreplenished pumping. And so under assured water supply rules, a predetermined volume of groundwater can be withdrawn by the designated provider or by the certificate of assured water supply holder without being replenished or offset, and that balance is referred to as the groundwater allowance, which we'll break down further in subsequent slides. Next slide. Looking now at incidental recharge as a component of offset for the municipal sector. Next slide. So in addition to the replenishment requirements for those providers serving the assured water supply demand, this sector, of course, also earns incidental recharge, or their demands are offset by incidental recharge. So for the municipal sector, that rate is calculated as a % of total sector demand. And for the purposes of safe yield, this rate is 4%, which is established in assured water supply rules. Next slide. So here is the demand equation with the figures from the table plugged in for the 5-year average for Phoenix AMA. Groundwater demand for muni sector Phoenix AMA is 226,061 acre feet, just over 226,000 acre feet a year. The offset is 103,910 acre feet per year, leaving an unreplenished demand of 122,151. So you can stay here for a moment, but in the subsequent slides we'll break down those numbers a little more. Next slide. Okay, so putting that into context, as I did previously, for the Phoenix AMA, a little less than half of the municipal sector's groundwater demand is offset by replenishment and incidental recharge, leaving, of course, more than half of the sector's groundwater demand as unreplenished demand. Overall, and again, moving to the right, how this sector's unreplenished demand plays into all sectors' unreplenished demand for Phoenix AMA is that it contributes roughly 3/10 of the total unreplenished groundwater demand for the Phoenix AMA. So now we'll look more at groundwater allowances and try to highlight the interplay between these groundwater allowances and unreplenished demand. So at the top of the slide, you have your groundwater allowance equation, essentially, with the components that are added in and the component that is subtracted. So a groundwater allowance has a starting balance assigned at the time that the designation was issued. In addition to that, every year there is incidental recharge rate, which ranges from 4 to 6% for Phoenix AMA, and extinguishment credits. Then subtracted from all those three components is the non-exempt groundwater pumping, and pumping that occurs pursuant to long-term and annual credits for covered poor quality water exemption or drought exemption are considered exempt groundwater pumping, and they are not a component of that non-exempt groundwater pumping, so they would not be subtracted from the groundwater allowance. Next slide. Okay, so this table shares data from 2019 for both designated providers in the Phoenix AMA, as well as certificates being served by undesignated providers and belonging to CAGRID within the Phoenix AMA. I do want to give a quick thank you to Dave Dunaway at CAGRD for very quickly providing this data for me for certificated lands within CAGRD member lands, which is the bottom portion of that table on your screen. So thank you. Okay, and now looking at the data. So the farthest left column on the top row shows the sum of groundwater allowances for designated providers in Phoenix AMA as of 2019 in acre feet. So it is just over 4 million acre feet. Moving right, the sum of replenishment obligation for designated providers in Phoenix AMA for 2019 was 7,627 acre feet, and the sum of non-exempt groundwater pumping, so that would be the sum subtracted from that 4 million number on the far left side, was 53,567 acre feet, and the incidental recharge rate for that same year was 40,609. Moving to certificated provider or certificates in Phoenix AMA that are within CAGRD member lands. So these figures you can, we did an estimate, and it should account for anywhere between 70 to 75% of certificates within the Phoenix AMA would be within CAGRD member lands. So do note that. So the sum of pre-reported groundwater allowances for certificates was 461,788, and the sum of replenishment was 18,761. And at this point, you can probably guess what I'm going to say next, which is I'm going to put the numbers into context. Next slide. So there are 15 designated providers in the Phoenix AMA, and just under half of those providers have a groundwater allowance with a net positive % change. So what that means, in other words, is that just under half of the designated providers in the Phoenix AMA have groundwater balances that are increasing, and just over half have groundwater balances that are decreasing. In addition to that, one designated provider had that replenishment obligation we looked at in the previous slide for 2019, and approximately 3/4 of the total amount of that non-exempt groundwater pumping subtracted from the groundwater allowance for the year 2019 will be replaced and added back into the balance for 2020 as a result of the incidental recharge rate. So what is the significance of all of this in the larger context and story of unreplenished groundwater in the AMAs? So the replenishment obligation for the municipal sector only accounts for about 16% of total groundwater demand for the sector, and current and future replenishment obligation is directly tied to existing groundwater allowances. So this slide, I wanted to just highlight the relationship, some of the more complex relationships that come out when you're looking at unreplenished groundwater data. So, and that wraps up the municipal sector. Moving on to industrial sector, you have your groundwater demand, of course, which is for this sector comprised of sand and gravel, mining, turf, electric power, and dairy, cattle feedlots, and others. Some miscellaneous industrial sector components are captured in that other component. For this sector, you also have incidental recharge as your offset. And I think you all know the asterisk at this point, so I won't belabor that anymore. Next slide. As an overview, again, this sector is not required to replenish, and they are subject to those mandatory conservation requirements that are administered through the management plans. And withdrawals, groundwater withdrawals from this sector can be expected to continue and grow alongside municipal growth, as those two sectors are intuitively interdependent. Looking at industrial recharge, or incidental recharge for the industrial sector. As I stated just a moment ago, does not have a replenishment requirement, and so the industrial, but it is earning a incidental recharge, or rather the incidental recharge is what comprises the offset to groundwater demand for this sector, and so that is calculated by a unique rate applied to the various components of the sector. So a unique rate is applied to the electric power plants versus turf facilities, et cetera. And then all of those rates are compiled and summed to get your overall incidental recharge rate for the industrial sector. So here are the numbers. Groundwater demand for this sector comprises approximately 107,000 acre-feet a year. Offset is 9,149 acre-feet a year, leaving your unreplenished demand at 97,875 acre-feet per year. Next slide. So putting those numbers into context in the same form that I have for the previous sectors, less than 1/10 of the industrial sector's groundwater demand is offset by incidental recharge, and a little more than 9/10 of the industrial sector's demand. So 1/10 is offset, leaving, of course, 9/10 as the unreplenished groundwater demand. So how this fits into the bigger picture for all sectors is that the industrial sector's unreplenished groundwater demand contributes to just under 3/10 of the total unreplenished groundwater demand for the Phoenix AMA. And with that, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Natalie Mast, who's going to show you a very cool dashboard that looks at the same sectors we just talked about and breaks it down a little in a different way.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenna. Let me get situated here. Just 1 second. And I'm actually going to have to, sorry, give me 1 moment here. Share a different item. So this, whoops. There we go. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I think many of you know me. My name is Natalie Mast. I am the Active Management Areas Director responsible for the management plans here at ADWR. I had previously presented a dashboard at the February 2020 meeting of this committee. I'm going to pull that back up. We've added to that a little bit. I'm not going to go into as much detail as I did in that past meeting, but I would encourage you to, if you have kind of more questions about that dashboard, I would encourage you to go back and review that February 2020 meeting video. So John, could you, thank you. We're going to drop the link to this dashboard in the chat, and you can also find it on the post-2025 page on our website under documents. It's posted right there. Oh, can we not? All right, give me 1 second. It doesn't look like the screen is sharing properly. Can you see the dashboard on yours? Okay, it's not showing up here for some reason. Okay, perfect. That works. Okay. So I'm just going to expand this dashboard a little bit as I talk through it so I can so you can see it a little bit better. So when I walked through this dashboard before, I focused kind of on the individual sectors and on the AMAs. Like I said, I'm not going to go into that level of detail today, but I want to repeat and reiterate some of what Jenna talked about here, and also provide you all with a source of additional information for you to dig into some of these numbers a little bit more. Particularly what I want to point out here is that the total supply portfolio of each AMA has an influence on unreplenished demand, and the way that water is used in each AMA has an influence on unreplenished demand. So this is the dashboard you saw last time. There's 2 charts here. This is our kind of unreplenished water chart. This is our overdraft chart. This 0 line you see here is kind of a balance. So the darker bars down here are inflows to the aquifer. These lighter lines on top are the outflows of the aquifer. So your inflows are going to be the offsets that Jenna talked about, the incidental recharge, the replenishment. And the outflows are going to be your groundwater demands, so your municipal, agricultural, industrial pumping and groundwater demands. So what you'll note here is that the red line that you see in between those 2 kind of up and down bars is the balance between those things. So you have your demands that are offset to some degree by the offsets, by the inflows, and the red line shows the balance between those 2 things. So that shows the volume of unreplenished demand. The difference between this unreplenished demand, you can kind of see in this lower chart, difference between unreplenished demand and say fields or overdraft, you can kind of see in this bottom chart here, and that's why I have this here. We do want to make the point that this unreplenished demand analysis does not include those natural components of recharge, because you can't attribute those natural components of recharge to a particular sector. And if you try to, it gets messy really quick. So what that tells us is that some level of unreplenished groundwater demand may be consistent with the safe field goal, but ultimately that amount is relatively small, and you have to kind of make some decisions about priorities about if you're going to split up that amount that's kind of okay and consistent with that safe field goal, how do you prioritize those types of uses? So this is the page that I showed last time. What I'll point out here is if you click on the numbers down here, you'll be able to see some additional tabs. Several of these tabs were here when I presented the data table or this dashboard last time, but we did add one new one. So I'll just click through these really quickly to show you what's here. This is the new tab that I'll talk through in just a moment. We do also have a list of what those allowable groundwater demands are for each sector. And at the very end, there is a table that just shows kind of the actual numbers, so you don't have to kind of hover over the graphics to get to those. So to go back to here, again, what you see here is that same chart that I described on that first tab, but instead of showing overdraft with it, you can see your total demands for that AMA down in this bottom chart. We do have filters here, so you can filter by AMA and by sector. So what I'll do right now is just talk quickly through each AMA, again, kind of making the point that differences in supplies influence how unreplenished demand occurs in an AMA, and how those supplies are used is going to influence how that unreplenished demand occurs in that AMA. We'll actually start from, we'll often go north to south, we'll go south to north today. So we'll start with Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is pretty unique in the AMAs in that its supply is almost entirely what we refer to in that AMA as water withdrawn from wells. For a lot of reasons we refer to it that way, basically groundwater or water that was underground. So what you see in terms of replenishment in that sector is that you have a little bit of agriculture in that AMA, so you have a little bit of replenishment associated with that. The purple shades are municipal, the yellow shades are industrial. So the makeup in this AMA leads to just a little bit of replenishment, and they do have pretty, you can see with the red line up here that they do have some pretty significant unreplenished demands. That AMA does tend to be a little more sensitive to rain events, drought, that kind of thing, and that's also part of why you see pretty significant fluctuations in those demands. That's a little bit unusual for this AMA. The demands in this AMA do respond pretty significantly to rainfall events and that type of thing to a level of significance that we don't necessarily see in the other AMAs. Tucson is a really interesting case when you look at their water portfolio over time. So what you see here is, so the red bars are groundwater. These bluish or greenish bars down at the bottom is Colorado River. So if you look at their total demands over time, that's actually stayed pretty flat. But what happened with Colorado River water becoming available in that AMA is they used that Colorado River water to offset groundwater demand. So their water, the breakdown of their water portfolio changed over time and allowed them to pretty significantly reduce both their groundwater, total groundwater use, and also their unreplenished demand. So you see that this line is still above that zero axis, but we pretty frequently talk about the Tucson AMA being at or around safe yield in the most recent years. So this is, again, kind of a demonstration of that point that I made at the very beginning, that some level of unreplenished pumping may be consistent with safe yield due to those natural recharge components, but that amount can be variable over time, and with changes in climatic conditions, with this drier future, those volumes may decrease over time. Oops, I want to go to, next we'll go to Pinal. So Pinal is kind of an interesting case again, because they are so agricultural heavy. You do actually see a pretty significant proportion in this AMA of kind of incidental recharge based replenishment. There is still overdraft in this AMA, there is still unreplenished pumping, but it's kind of an interesting case in seeing that the type of use makes a big difference in how much replenishment kind of naturally occurs. What we expect to see looking forward for this AMA is also something that's going to be really interesting to watch over time and really challenging for this AMA over time, where we anticipate that the Colorado River, the blue portion in that lower graph, that is going to decrease in the very near future here. And we expect a significant portion of that Colorado River supply to be replaced with groundwater. So we expect those groundwater volumes to increase, and we expect the unreplenished pumping in that AMA to also increase. Phoenix is an example where we have a really significant amount of surface water supplies. So you see Colorado River, you see salt and Verde water in this AMA, and you still see a significant amount of groundwater use. There is still unreplenished pumping in this AMA, but because those incidental recharge values in all sectors are based on total demand, because your total use can eventually infiltrate into the aquifer in different ways for each sector, because those incidental recharge rates are based on total demand, you see a pretty significant level of kind of inflows or offsets in the Phoenix AMA. So that's kind of an interesting case showing how that total portfolio really influences the level of offsets that you see in each AMA. And finally, all the way to the north, we get to Prescott. Prescott, again, is a really interesting case in they have what you see with that kind of black bar down at the bottom is effluent. They have really worked hard to increase their utilization of effluent in that AMA over time. But what you see is that they're also kind of working against some changing ratios of the types of uses in that AMA. So a lot of the agricultural type demands have disappeared in that AMA, and what you can see pretty clearly here is that that corresponds with a decrease in the incidental recharge associated with ag, and thus the total incidental recharge to the AMA, because the incidental recharge associated with municipal demands is so much lower. So it's kind of an interesting case, again, that point that I've reiterated a few times here, that the types of water really make a difference in how unreplenished groundwater occurs, and the types of uses make a really big difference in how the unreplenished groundwater occurs. And both of those things work together in really complex ways to contribute to how those trends of unreplenished water might change in the future. So I think what you can see here on this dashboard, I really do encourage you all to go online, click around on this dashboard, look into this data. There's a lot of really interesting information here. But I think what you've heard from Jenna today and from me in seeing this data is that all sectors, all AMAs have unreplenished groundwater. All sectors and all AMAs are contributing toward this issue, and all sectors, all AMAs have a role to play in the solutions for this. So with that, I think I will hand it back to, or we have more presentation, yes?
No, we do not. So we just have the questions and then, of course, discussion. So we can just go to the view so everybody can see each other. That looks great. And thank you.
There we go.
Thank you, Jenna and Natalie. That was a lot of information. I think the one clarifying question we probably all have, that presentation, is that going to be up on the post-2025 committee webpage?
Yes,
Or available?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
And as well, thank you for providing that link so people can work on those scenarios on their own. Now I want to move into questions for the department, and I was trying to figure out the best way to do this. I think we're going to go by sector. We'll start with the ag sector first. And again, this is just clarifying questions if concepts come out, but if you want to type in the chat, you have a question. It's hard to see, at least for me, to see people's hands raised. And we'll start with the questions in the ag sector first. I'm not seeing anyone. I'm trying to look through here. All right, we will move then to the municipal sector. Any
Cheryl?
question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Brian Betcher just put in a question
Oh, okay.
in the chat room.
Okay. Brian, do you want to pipe in, or do you want me to just go with the question? So, Jenna, I guess it was for you. Why is there 0 incidental recharge shown for the Pinal Ag in 2016?
Sorry, give me one moment here. I'm just going to double check that. That might just be an error in the data. Sorry about that, Brian. I will double check that data and make sure that that gets corrected on our website.
Thank you. Any other questions in the ag sector? All right, now moving to the municipal sector. And how about industrial?
Cheryl, this is Sandy.
Okay.
Don't really have anything specific to industrial. I think it's really more the general approach on this and really the objective of where are we going. You know, we can look at this many different ways. And as far as where I don't want to pick on any one sector or highlight any issues with any one sector. I mean, we can pull the numbers and look at, where the bulk of this is and where it may or may be, there may be trends in any specific direction or, really who's got the most, right? But that's not what I think we want to do. We want to talk about this more generally. So I'm going to hold my questions really for more of a general discussion than picking on anyone or trying to justify how we use water in our own sector or within the industrial and mining sector. So I think that's why you're not hearing anything.
I kind of figured that.
Well, I also like to think that perhaps it's because the presentation gave lots of good information, or else everyone's waiting to review it individually. But no, I think that's a good point, Sandy, of
I mean, we can pick this apart in pieces
Yeah.
and you consider this, did you consider that? And, but I don't think that's what people want to do here.
yeah, that, and as we noted at the beginning, we're all sectors are there's unreplenished groundwater withdrawals in all sectors. And so we're all in this together, and we need to look at is there anything we can do to address this issue? So Cheryl, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly where we need to go. So Sandy, I don't know if you want to go first or if other people want to move into this actual discussion part of, and I agree with Warren, I'd rather focus on how we're in this together and in providing solutions.
Yeah, I'm happy to start with some initial thoughts and concerns or general thoughts. Again, it's, presenting the data the way we have, we've sort of put certain sectors in certain light, and you can pull apart and say, well, the vast majority of this is, and I'm not picking on ag, but you could say that. But that's, I think the comment that Warren made is that we're all in it together. And I guess what sticks out in my mind is, I don't know that everybody has a clear picture, maybe everybody on this call, the history of why this groundwater, why the groundwater allowances were created, why what were the trade-offs, ag, and again, pointing to ag where no new agricultural growth can occur in an AMA, that was a trade-off. And some of the details on the creation of irrigation and non-irrigation grandfathered rights and sort of their, what the assumptions were at the time. And I think, I hope everybody's on the same page there, because there's some very important history to that. As far as, I guess it's just a really general question for the group and for the authors is, where did we want to go with this? I mean, and one piece of data that's missing here is if we required replenishment of all these water uses, is there sufficient surface water or CAP out there to do that? I mean, that's the first question. I mean, where are we to get this replenishment source? And if you're really aiming to reduce groundwater use, why don't we focus on reducing groundwater use? What have we done in each sector to reduce groundwater use? Are the conservation requirements sufficient to do that? Do they address that? And maybe that's the angle we need to be looking at, as opposed to requiring competition for water supplies, where we already have a GRD that, I mean, if we pointed out previously in this, that has a need for surface water or non-groundwater supplies, I'll say. And are we creating, competition for supply that's insufficient to meet the obligation? If we already have one short, the GRD is potentially, I'm not saying they're short, but they certainly need to find alternative supplies. And now you're going to have a proverbial race of, very money, it's just, I don't know. It's, do we have enough to create that sort of competition? That's my first big question for the group.
This is Sarah Porter. I think that's an interesting question to start with. Should we focus on unreplenished groundwater withdrawals or groundwater withdrawals in general? And I'd be very interested to hear people's thoughts on that. It seems to me that it's more achievable to try to focus on reducing unreplenished groundwater withdrawals, and that would help accomplish the goal of reducing groundwater dependence generally. But I'm very interested to hear other thoughts about that.
This is Doug.
Go for it.
So I guess my question then, to follow up on Sarah's point, would be if we are going to look at groundwater use reductions, what else are we going to do? It kind of goes back to what Sandy's point was. Are we all going to start chasing these limited renewable supplies that are out there? Some people brought up the concern that, there's already too much competition for it. So second part of my question then also is how much of the conservation piece should we look at? Because if we get better conservation all the way across the board, not only does that reduce the groundwater consumption, it makes those other renewable supplies go further. So how much does that have to play into it? And then I guess if we really want to look at over time, I'm thinking specifically within the municipal sector, there was a lot of allowable uses that happened early on in the code as things first started getting put in place, specifically under assured water supply, that's not allowed now, and how much of that should continue. As Sandy said, there was trade-offs. Hey, if you were the first guys out to get designated, you got 3 free years of groundwater use and all sorts of other perks. That's not available anymore. We can spend a huge amount of time diving into those kinds of details, or do we want to stick to these more broader questions first?
So I'm just going to throw out a thought here. I think the questions are good to ask, and it's also okay to get any ideas that could help address the unreplenished groundwater withdrawals. They could be ideas about replenishment, but I would suggest that this isn't just about finding another supply and competing on about competing, but it's also, are there some other areas such as has been referenced about conservation that could be helpful? And I think putting out some ideas helps to generate then generates more ideas and can then help maybe look at this. I mean, the bottom line is we still allow groundwater pumping that does not require doesn't require replenishment. And there's historic reasons for that. And those need to be, we need to be sensitive to that and understand that. And at the same time, with 40 years of experience and looking beyond 2025, we have an opportunity here to see, well, is there some ways that we can further address this issue of unreplenished groundwater withdrawals?
It's Spencer.
Go, Spencer.
Yeah, thank you. This presentation, I think, first of all, everybody probably needs to look at it a little deeper. There was a lot of good information the department threw out. We probably need to gel on it for a while. But you know, we've spent a lot of time talking, obviously, about the GRD, the replenishment the GRD does, specifically for the growth that my members create. Obviously, we're glad we're not a part of the problem in the sense that we replenish 96% of the water we mine, and that's an important context because we spend a lot of time talking about that, how growth's going to occur, whether it's going to occur on groundwater or not. And so discussing this, which is very, very important, I think, because our ultimate obligation is to get to safe yield. And I think we need to dive into this information much deeper. You know, we've talked a little bit about conservation, and Warren, you just brought that up, and I think that's an important conversation. But the conservation, if I understand it, really allows you to do more with what you got. It doesn't necessarily address the issue of unreplenished groundwater pumping to achieve safe yield. And those are two different goals. And I think conservation, although is a good goal, obviously, we need to really look deeper at the issue of unreplenished groundwater use. Everybody on this in this meeting knows that we're going to face significant hurdles, probably sooner rather than later, in the Phoenix AMA. And the numbers that were thrown out in these presentation about the amount of unreplenished groundwater that can be used is significant. I think I saw one figure of 4 million acre feet. Those are not small figures. And this has been going on for years, if not decades. And we need to look at this in a deep dive, especially with these large designated providers, these large undesignated providers, and identify who's doing what and how severe the problem is to the AMA. So I think this was a good first step. I think there's a lot of conversations we can have around this and ideas that can be brought to the table to help solve this problem. But if we don't, everybody knows if we don't meet safe yield and reduce our groundwater demand, our impacts reduce to the groundwater table, then we're going to face a tough future.
So Spencer, I just want to clarify. So you're wanting to look at boring down more into who is impacting groundwater pumping the most, and also look at augmentation, or?
I think, when we first developed the Groundwater Management Act and the AMA system, there were a lot of incentives put in place to reduce groundwater use. Okay. We've adopted conservation measures to reduce the groundwater. Have those worked? So the whole system is designed to reduce the use of unreplenished groundwater over time. So the question is, has that system worked? And if not, what gaps need to fill to ensure it does work? And so I think you can only do that by looking at these unreplenished groundwater pumping rights over time to see what can be done to reduce that. That's my opinion. I'm not a huge fan of people running to the river. I think all the conversations we've had, I think the situation in Pinal does nothing but create pressure to go to the river. And I don't think that's being talked about in a larger context outside of this group. And I think it's quite honestly a very, very difficult situation, and we're headed to a train wreck. And so I'm not a big fan of that, but I think there is a way to dive into what's being done today and look at incentives and opportunities. And I think Sandy said it well. We can't necessarily pick winners and losers, but sectors need to be looked at as it relates to developing incentives and reasonable opportunities to reduce this groundwater demand. And it has to be done, or else we're just we're gonna end up like Pinal County and God knows when.
Okay, I get it, and I do appreciate that, because it is an in-between stage, because any augmentation is going to take decades. So what do others think about the incentive side of it by sectors?
So this is Sarah. I really appreciate what Spencer just had to say, and I also want to say thanks to Jenna and Natalie for your reports. I agree with Spencer that I want to spend some time really going through that. It was like drinking from a fire hose, as these meetings often are. But maybe it would be helpful if I went ahead and put some ideas on the table, and they may not be as granular as what Spencer is proposing. But maybe my only concern about, and I'm sorry, Spencer, if I'm making any assumptions. I think you just said no winners and losers, and I agree with you. I think if we drill down too much into this sector or that sector, we're really at risk. And instead, focusing on incentives is better way to go. So let me suggest that we made in our recent report, The Myth of Safe Yield, we put out some suggestions. I've just put it in the chat on page 23, some suggestions to reduce residual groundwater use. And so you can all link to that report and look at page 23, but hopefully read in the pages leading up to that, so you can see an analysis of how the groundwater management has fared to date. And I think it's without question that the groundwater management has got us very far. It's done a lot of good, but we can see that we're not quite at the point where we can get to safe yield with the tools that we have right in the toolbox right now. So we put out some recommendations for consideration on page 23. They include a 5% reduction in groundwater use over a 5-year period, a mined groundwater fee to help equalize the cost or value of groundwater in comparison with available renewable supplies, a maximum annual groundwater decline rate for wells used by residual pumpers. We've suggested looking at other mechanisms to encourage new urban development on ag lands, especially when those lands are in proximity to municipal providers that have access to renewable supplies and infrastructure. And also to develop incentives to encourage existing users to convert renewable supplies like reclaimed water. So those are just some suggestions we make in the report, and they could be a basis for a conversation that could get us to working together to think of workable solutions to start to speed up this goal of decreasing residual pumping.
Thank you,
Cheryl?
Sarah. Sarah, if you could, I appreciate you referencing the report. If you could send Warren and me that list, that full list from page 23, that would be helpful.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that.
Okay. I'm sorry, who did I interrupt?
You didn't interrupt, I interrupted you. This is Sandy.
Okay.
I think that's a great place to start, what Sarah has put on the table as potential options to discuss. And I think that's an excellent way to approach this issue. The department staff did a great job of sort of outlining the issue. I think it just brought up a lot of, well, what does it mean and what do we do, and who are you pointing at, and and we don't need to do that. And I think we've all said that, and we all agree that that's the way to, or that's not the way to do it. So approaching it from the standpoint of what can we do to reduce groundwater pumping across the sectors. And it has to be clear that it's across the sectors, not in any one particular sector, but across the sectors. And economics and everything has to come into play, and the conversation has to, we just have to vet that conversation and focusing on potential solutions. And I appreciate what you and Warren have been saying. I just think it's, we're all saying the same thing. And so I appreciate what Sarah's done, is putting something on the table to start from. And I would hope that that's where we go.
Thank you, Sandy. And Natalie did post those recommendations in the chat, but I want to go to Gretchen Baumgartner. You wanted to comment on
Yeah,
Sarah's
thank you. I appreciate it. I'm Gretchen Baumgartner with the city of Scottsdale, and I just wanted to echo one of Sarah's thoughts, and that was the increasing the groundwater withdrawal fee and or a mined groundwater fee. Just anecdotally, as a municipal provider, is we use conservation incentives, but we also use price signals. And I think that's a really important component because that does move the needle. Also, anecdotally, I have had conversations with groundwater pumpers, and when talking to them, providing them other avenues of water usage, when we talk about the different prices between, for example, groundwater and the difference with effluent usage, there's a big gap, and it's hard to have that conversation with them when their groundwater pumping is so much cheaper than providing a source like effluent. So I think a price signal would be a really great tool. And I do agree, Sarah, in that there's going to be a lot of tools in the toolbox that we're going to have to use. It's going to be a suite of options. So I would throw that out as a suggestion of upping that and finding ways to use those funds in ways we already do, but increasingly so. Thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen. Bass.
Hello, Cheryl. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. So, having that discussion about a mine groundwater fee in isolation of the broader measures that we have adopted, the trade-offs that were made, and all that is in reference to Sandy's earlier statement, is I want to frame that a little bit. So agriculture said, we'll take an IGFR. It will go down over time based on the management plans, but you can never grow one bit. Okay, that's for agriculture. So when you contrast that with whatever other use, whomever, municipal, whatever, and then you put in the equation a mined groundwater fee, it it's a little bit apples and oranges between those sectors. You've got a sector that can never grow one bit. And so as you reduce, their demand, whatever, not just the fee, but the 5% reduction, then you're just telling them you got to shrink. In other areas, they can grow, they are growing, and their options for a 5% reduction don't necessarily mean that they shrink. So as we talk about these kind of things, I want us to also go back to a review as what Sandy said earlier about what did the act actually do and what were the trade-offs that were made, and because we're not all apples and apples. Thanks.
Thank you, Bass. Rob Anderson.
Yeah, I just I wanted to couple of points. One is thanks to DWR staff for putting this together. The information is very useful, and I think our data points are very helpful to us understanding the problem. And as with Spencer and Sarah, I want to get into the details of this and understand it a little bit better. But thanks to them for putting that together. To Sarah's point, I do think, well, to Sandy's point, I don't think we should get into the habit of pointing at each other's sectors. But I do want to point out something that I think is borne out by this information. When we're talking about the municipal sector, new growth is basically required to replenish. That's really one of the bright spots, I think, in our Groundwater Management Act, is that we've imposed that obligation, and that results in solving some of these other problems. When we do grow, we don't always grow on farmland, but when we do grow on farmland, we reduce that unreplenished groundwater demand. So there may be some incentives there that we could be looking at. But the new growth sector also generates effluent, which doesn't really come through in this presentation very well. So it's a positive story when we talk about new residential growth. But the point I wanted to make about that was not to say, oh, look at how much better we're doing. The point I wanted to make is what we did there is we created structures that allowed that to happen. CAGRD, for example. We created a known system to allow this particular sector to pay for replacing groundwater if it was going to rely on it. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about in terms of as we go forward. What kind of structures do we have in place here that would encourage reductions in groundwater use? What kind of systems do we have out there that actually discourage it? And I would say that there are some things we could be looking at in our regulatory systems, in our how do we go and acquire new supplies? How do we develop those supplies in a way that doesn't put us into competition? I mean, I think we would all agree that going forward in the future, in order to assure the economic development of the state as a whole, we need to be looking at developing and augmenting water supplies. And I think we need to get into that discussion more. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Rob. I'll put my Valley Partnership hat on. I agree with that. Going into comments, just kind of going in order. Brett Flex, City of Peoria.
Hi, thanks for the time today, and thanks for hosting this meeting. To kind of piggyback a little bit on Mr. Anderson's looking forward, one of the places where I think maybe we could start to look at how do we address future reliance on groundwater? And I know that the suggestion I'm about to make is not new to anybody, but it's also could fit either in this topic or growth on groundwater, and that is exemptions to the replenishment obligation. And what I'm getting at there is that we all know that the Assured Water Supply program exists primarily as a homeowner protection, and therefore, when you put in homes, they have to have a replenishment obligation. But there are quite a few exemptions to that based on the subdividing rules, and I think that's one place where we can start. And I know that's a place that's been brought up probably for longer than I've been alive. But just to provide an example, a real world example, is that recently the city of Peoria acquired a private water provider that was had member lands within it. And the demand of this private water provider fluctuated around, let's say, 1,900 acre feet per year. About 400 to 500 acre feet of that demand were not member lands. So that was unreplenished pumping being served by a private non-designated water provider every year. And that demand wasn't necessarily old either. All of those homes were built since the year 2000. And so I think we need to look really hard at when we say that growth going forward is largely on replenished renewable supplies, because we're looking at scenarios within our own incorporated boundaries where there's quite a bit of unreplenished pumping for the businesses, for example, that support those homes. And I think we can agree that if the goal of the Assured Water Supply program is to protect homeowners, and you have unreplenished pumping happening right next to replenished pumping for homes, the aquifer isn't probably going to distinguish how it wants to be resilient for the homes versus the non-homes, I'll call it that. So I think that's a great place to start, is looking at those exemptions to the existing rules, because it doesn't require us to go backwards and rehash fights. It requires us to look forward and decide how we want to grow. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Yeah, that is definitely a concern that I know we are running into at Valley Partnership. A lot of comments in the chat, building upon what started with Bass's comment. Dave Roberts from SRP. I don't know if you want to say anything, Dave, but he was talking about the mine groundwater fee and how with ag, or a farmer, I should say, it is tough to pay, and how it can only be done with partnerships between the sectors. And that, I think, is what some of what Rob Anderson was talking about. Dave, do you want to add anything?
Sure. When you look at the various sectors, it's obvious the municipalities have more wherewithal to gain access to water supplies that can be used in place of groundwater. And the agricultural sector does not at this stage. Most of the agricultural water use in the Phoenix area is all on groundwater. So somehow we have to find ways where, and I'll just pick agriculture, you could do this for industry as well. Somehow you have to find a way for the municipal sector or even the tribal sector to work with agriculture in ways that can lead to creative opportunities to help the cities and the municipalities to utilize their supplies that maybe aren't as utilized as effectively as they are today, in a way that reduces groundwater pumping and mine groundwater in the ag sector. And there are those ways out there. We just have to explore them and see if they can be put together. So that's what I would suggest. And you could do that in the industrial sector as well.
All right, I might need more information on that, Dave, but I'll follow up with you. Eric Braun, he was supporting what Rob was talking about. Eric, do you want to speak to this? He was specifically saying, what other incentives do we have in place that should be strengthened if they are working? Oh, Eric, I think you're on mute. No. We'll come back to you. But again, I do think that's knowing, I think somebody else mentioned that earlier about the incentives and what's working. Then looking here, Bob Marsh is talking about augmentation, which I think we all would agree augmentation is important for all of us together. You know, as we talked about at the Governor's Augmentation Council, or actually Speaker Bowers talked about his fund, which is really geared toward looking at out of state and funding that. So that is something that is going to be important to all of us. Any other thoughts? Because we have a lot here. We need to pull the incentives. Yes.
Miss Sandy, sorry, I had my hand raised.
I can't look at both, sorry.
Yeah, learn how to, yeah, come on.
I know. There's only so much I can do.
Or you're in charge of hands. Anyway, you know, just to tap on or to tag on to what Dave said in providing, you know, creating partnerships and allowing, you know, either incentivizing or, you know, private industry has a role in this. And I think that you know, there's been historically some reticence about, you know, large projects that include private industry and providing that private entity access to and a right to the source of water that's developed. And so I'd like to add to this list, you know, really removing any of those barriers. Now I can't point specifically to where those barriers are located, but there's definitely been some historic reticence in partnering with private business and private entities in developing regional water supplies. And that's, you know, that is definitely an arena that Freeport's looking at, where we're, you know, as we're looking to develop non-groundwater sources, we want to look at partnering with our communities, with tribal entities and others. So.
Sandy, have the legal hurdles, or are there legal hurdles to that partnering that we could focus in on?
You know, I've never come across a legal hurdle. I think it's more of a perceptual problem when you have private business in, let's say, you know, cooperating in conjunction with a public utility system. Okay. You know, that's really more where I've run into it from where I sit now, and even when I was back at the department, that came up several times that we have to be careful about allowing private industry to have you know, access to and be part of a system like that. And maybe I'm just missing the legal hurdles, but it really.
Oh, I was thinking more if it's, you know, like it's done in transportation, you know, if there's a payback, but it sounds like the commodity is
the
payback.
And I'm sure that has a lot to do with the.
But the infrastructure side of it, probably. Yeah. But the utility already has it. Yeah.
Yeah. There's no incentive for private industry to get grants or things like that. They're very limited for private industry, federal grants, you know, state funds, not so much, but more along the federal grant side of things. But the industry can be a part of that and help provide the match that's required when you're partnering. So it's just, like I said, I don't know where this originates. It's just something, it was just a barrier that I kept running into when we were trying to talk more and more about public-private partnerships.
Thank you. Sarah, you have a comment?
Yeah, I really appreciate this discussion today. And what Sandy was just saying is, well, really worth considering as is the idea of what kinds of really creative partnerships between cities and ag, for example, or cities and industry could help get to reduced residual groundwater pumping. Often in these meetings, we hear the concern that we're not talking about augmentation, and I want to address that here, and that's to say, if we don't take care of the groundwater pumping, the augmentation project isn't going to pay off. There might even be a question about financing. It wasn't just Governor Babbitt's cleverness that that forced the Groundwater Management Act so that we could have the CAP. That was actually stipulated in the Basin Projects Act that Arizona needed to take care of its overdraft problem before the federal government would finance the CAP. We then saw that we had a new augmentation supply that was too expensive for some of the users that were expected to use it. And we scrambled as a state to come up with a way to create one of those partnerships that Dave just talked about, where municipal users essentially subsidize the use of CAP water by agriculture. So this is all to say, it's fine to talk about augmentation. We should be having those discussions, but augmentation is not going to solve the problem of residual groundwater pumping when that water is the most affordable water. And I think almost everyone agrees that any augmentation project is going to bring in the most expensive water ever brought into the state of Arizona. So if I were prioritizing, I would say come up with a plan for dealing with residual groundwater. That plan may include components of augmentation, but we mustn't walk away from the groundwater issues. We have to at least have those two conversations at the same time. Otherwise, we won't have a market for our expensive new augmentation water.
Well noted, Sarah. And Eric, you're back. Eric Braun.
Maybe.
You are.
Okay. Well, what it's worth, I'm back. I just wanted to kind of latch onto what Rob was saying about using existing incentives and looking at the structures that are already there in the groundwater code. And this kind of goes back to what some of the other folks were also saying about, are these things working? And if they are, maybe we need to look at strengthening them, increasing them. We've got incentives, and then we've also got a couple of kind of structural ways that we try to meet this offset of groundwater pumping. And I just point out one that I'm the most familiar with as a municipal provider is the cut to the aquifer, where when a municipal provider stores water for the future, there's a 5% reduction that is cut to the aquifer for CAP water supplies. And this is one of the tools that was pointed out in the presentation that offsets unreplenished groundwater. It doesn't apply to all water supplies or annual storage and recovery of any water supplies. So it could be one tool that we look at that's already in existence. How do we strengthen it? And what kind of an impact would that make? And if we start to look at other tools that are already out there to help offset groundwater pumping, and try to make some judgments on whether or not they are being effective, and if we increase them or change them, what kind of impacts would we have? So I like the road that Rob was going down, and I thought I would just use a specific example of how that could work.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Henry Day, he made a comment, and Henry, you're welcome to pipe in. Individual water users of any sector can look at technological improvements, set goals to reduce groundwater consumption. Henry, you want to add to that?
You bet. Thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, I think that as a company or a municipality or an agricultural user, each of us has an obligation to look at how to use water more efficiently. And as an example, one of our plants, we replaced an old inefficient plant with a new one that was 85% more efficient in water consumption. And we continue to look at those types of things as we move forward. I think in our business, we can also incent our customers to use less power, which requires water with energy efficiency programs. We're looking more at renewable energy that doesn't take water. We're looking at wind power. We're looking at solar power, ways to reduce our overall water footprint and our water intensity. And I think each of us has to start thinking about what we can do with our current water footprint and set goals to reduce not only total water consumption, but specifically non-renewable water consumption like groundwater.
Thank you, Henry. Michelle Vinquathan, I know you've typed in some stuff. Do you want to speak to this, or do you?
I'll make a brief comment. Can you hear me?
I can.
I think that the value of increasing the cost of using groundwater should be evaluated. I know it's not popular with any sector, but it's a known, well-established tool that will increase conservation. And although most industrial and farming users already have an incentive to use less because then they have less cost in treatment or pumping or whatever, there is a cost benefit analysis that is changed when the cost of using the water goes up. For instance, if you have somebody who's doing wet cooling of infrastructure and the cost of groundwater goes up, that may drive their cost benefit analysis towards dry cooling. You know, but if the cost of groundwater is still cheap enough, maybe wet cooling still, even though it's expensive, you know, still makes sense as opposed to dry cooling. So it does factor into even those commercial decisions. And so it should be looked at as a potential tool that I think would probably be as or more effective than regulation. That's all I had.
Thank you. Joe Singleton.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'll just bring up I just had a practical comment. I think this is a great discussion and there's a lot of great ideas that have been thrown out there. But thinking back to the timeline that you and Warren have laid out for this process, I think I'll bring up the unpopular that we might need to focus a little bit on the art of the possible as we kind of go through these tasks and see which ones we actually think that we're going to have time to shape up into some kind of a usable form for whatever's next. I suspect that there's a lot of really good things that we're not going to necessarily have enough meetings to put enough time into to get to something that looks like a solution, but maybe we can tee it up for something else at some point in the future. Also, I agree with Sandy and everybody else. If we start trying to pick this apart by sector, we can be here for a really long time until absolutely everybody is unhappy.
Thank you, Joe. Sandy.
Sorry. So on the ground, you know, increasing our mined groundwater fee or increasing the cost for pumping groundwater, you know, looking at incentives and incentivizing people with some, you know, with some regulatory caps, you know, maybe looking at reducing the allotments and things like that. What we don't want to do is create a, you know, taking money to make people go spend money. I mean, that's a difficult thing. Would we rather have people use their money to go, you know, to improve technologies, as Henry said, or acquire renewable supplies or create partnerships? So I'm not a big fan of disincentivizing via increased groundwater fees. And I just would want to, you know, I'd want to have that conversation, and I agree there needs to be a conversation, I guess is what I'm saying, but I caution that with you're taking money away so people can go spend money. That makes it a little tougher.
Got it. I am hearing some themes here. And Dave, do you want to add in? Dave Roberts?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I also agree with Sandy. I don't think we can just throw out a bunch of regulations or, you know, suggest increasing costs or paying more for whatever without some kind of a carrot. I mean, there needs to be sticks and carrots with both of these things. So what is the benefit to the individual user if they're going to pay a fee or a higher fee? I mean, we need to think about it from that standpoint.
Yeah.
Can I have Dave to repeat that first part of what he said?
Yeah, that first part, I think this is
Yeah.
being recorded, Dave Roberts.
What did you say?
I don't think
Agree
you
with
can.
who?
With you, Sandy. Yes, I did agree with you.
we'll mark that as our first outcome.
I'm tearing up here.
We only have about 10 more minutes. To Joe's point of what's feasible, I am hearing some themes. First off, we're not going to pick out any segments. The second is looking at existing incentives, what's working, what maybe doesn't exist in one area that could help in other areas, partnerships. This is, and I need to look back, but those are just the things that came to my head of maybe where we want to spend some time. Lauren, do you want to come up with anything as well? Are we missing anything here?
Well, I've been frantically taking lots of notes, and I agree that this has been a really good conversation and discussion, and certainly appreciate all the feedback that's been given. I appreciate Joe kind of bringing us back to the reality that we do have a short time frame here. And so it will be really important that we focus on what is doable in the short term. But I also agree with the statement that this is also an opportunity to, by putting it on the list, so to speak, or by putting this out there, putting different ideas out there, it gives us an opportunity to recognize where we could kind of work over a number of years, or particularly next year. So the challenge is that Cheryl and I want to review the list that we're putting together, including last month's discussion, and see if we can kind of identify those areas that are most realistic to generate support. Whether it may just end up being a handful, or maybe we can get more than just a handful, but it's important to be realistic on that. And I think, as we said at the very beginning, we're all contributing to residual groundwater pumping. And so we need to look at how we can collectively work on that, so again, I appreciate the conversation today that kept us focused on that. I like the idea, Cheryl, that you noted, that others were noting, that existing incentives and looking at what is working. Are there ways that we can improve that, such as what Brett Fleck mentioned about, are there some exemptions that maybe we ought to revisit? And as was also noted about, looking at something as simple as maybe a cut to the aquifer for annual storage and recovery, particularly outside of the area of impact. These aren't necessarily all simple, but it's great to have these ideas out there, and look forward to keep working on them.
And again, DWR staff, thank you for your amazing job and your presentation. Once you all, if you haven't already, once you get it posted to our website, if you can let everyone know, that would be wonderful. And because there was a lot of people wanting to look further in this data, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. I should be able to post that within 24 hours along with the meeting recording from today.
Perfect.
There was such great discussion. So I'll send out an email to the full list when both of those things are posted.
And the dashboard is already available on that post-2025 page on our website as well.
Perfect.
And real quick, I couldn't agree more with Chris Udall's comment. It'd be great if we can find some short-term solutions that actually apply to the long term, because really, the whole name of this committee is post-2025, and for me, that's also, looking, what are we providing, what are we setting up for the next generation and then the generation after that, so that they can enjoy living here in Arizona just like we have. So thanks, Chris, for that comment.
Well, I want to thank everyone. This has been a really good discussion today and online, which is hard to manage. And I appreciate everyone being forthright and respectful. And I thought it was a very good day. So Warren, we have one more meeting where we're going to go in depth, correct?
That's right. We're going to meet in September to look at, on September 9th, that's a Thursday at 1 o'clock, and we will be diving in more on the hydrologic disconnect discussion. And so looking forward to getting together with everyone at that time. Again, that's on September 9th at 1 o'clock.
And we do have a recording of this, but again, please email Warren and me with any other ideas or questions or concerns, and that we can, as we start pulling this together to get ready for our prioritizing meetings, that's going to be really important. So with that, I think we are done for today. A little early. Enjoy your extra 7 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.